Hello ladies, welcome to Homemakers Radio. Hope you get a little bit done today while you listen. And before you go about your homemaking, I would like to share my teacup with you. It's a bird. I love these round bowl-like shapes of teacups. I think the tea always tastes better and they're thin. And there's the saucer. I'll get a picture of that for you. And today I'm going to be reading a little bit more from the Booker T. Washington book, and I said in the previous video, this is a continuation from the previous video, and if you are not dressed yet, I would suggest you do, or if you're just not feeling well, just relax and listen to the stories that I'm going to read today. I'm hoping to read some more of Anne of Green Gables from a book collection. It was a homeschool book, and it was a collection of different pieces of literature, but I've had to order my own copy of Anne of Green Gables because my family liked it so much. I think that somebody took off with it, and so I wanted to go ahead and finish reading that to you sometime, but I have some more to read to you from this. And I also would like to suggest that in these times of feeling rather restricted and isolated, that you don't restrict your mind and that you indulge in whatever it takes to make you happy. And what I mean by that is not anything that's debilitating or bad for you, but whatever is good for you, and including a scent. You know, the other day I got up, I thought, you know, I just need something that scents the home that I like, and I got into my baking cupboard and I found all kinds of things and put them on in a little dish full of water and put them on one of those little hot plates that you plug in and just let it simmer. And it was coconut oil, coconut flavoring, and a little bit of nutmeg and a few other things that I like, some little dash of orange, dried orange peels, and things that I like. And you can do that too. Just find something and make sure your senses are happy, and also enjoy the little things in life. You know, when everything was normal and I was indulging in participating in everything outside of the home, I didn't really have time to enjoy it as much as I do now. Now, I did go out and have a look to see what everyone was doing. Everything's busy. The traffic is high. Everyone's out. This is summer here. Everybody's out on their bikes, and everybody's down at the lake just doing what they want to do. But I really like it better at home. It's quieter, and I'm really looking forward to my day because I outline it, and I have classes I'm looking forward to online, and I'm taking a cooking course and an art course and enjoying it so much. And these are things that I never even thought I could do because I live so far away that it would have taken, and most classes that I like would have been taking place at night, and I don't like to be driving at night. And so this way I can choose my time and I can stay home, and the cost is minimal compared to what it would be. And so I'm quite happy about that, and I would encourage you to do that too. Make yourself some appointments in the home of things to do, and it's just wonderful. I'm still having a lot of events in my home. I still have the ladies' Bible class and tea time once a week, and we still have company. We still have obligations and things that we have to do, but I do enjoy being home so much, and I think a lot of people are discovering it. So if you're just now discovering it, we'll start out by making sure that you have got dressed and being prepared for the day, even if you are, quote, just going to be home, because you're going to be amazed at how much dressing up helps. And I've reached the stage where I just really don't like it much out there as much, and I don't have anywhere to wear this stuff, so I thought, well, I'll just wear them at home, wear my clothes at home, fix myself up at home. And it makes me happier, and there's often a time when I will see people. But today I'm going to finish reading a little bit more about Booker T. Washington, and he talks about his family and the things that they decided to do. I hope I haven't lost it again. Okay, I've got it all here. I think I have read this to you before, and then of course my kids left little notes on the side here. Enjoy time with the children and nature, it says. It says here, After all of this that is said, the time when I get the most solid rest and recreation, and this man lived between 18, I believe it was 1856 and 1915, and it was quite funny to see how he was, how he gave his birth date as having been sometime. He's pretty sure he was born. I'm pretty sure that he exists, but he didn't have an exact date of his birthday. And he says, a sense of mystery pervades the first paragraph of this autobiography. Washington does not know the exact date or place of his birth, but he suspects he must have been born somewhere at some time. And so I thought that was interesting. So I wanted to read this to you. Out of the 12 months of a year, I suppose that on average I spend 6 months away from Tuskegee. He was the founder of Tuskegee Institute to help the people who had just been freed from slavery integrate into a life where they could learn to earn their own living. And he said, talked about rest. He says, after all this is said, the time when I get the most solid rest and recreation is when I can be at Tuskegee, and after our evening meal is over, we can sit down, as is our custom, with my wife and Portia and Baker and Davidson, my 3 children, and read a story, or each take a turn in telling a story. To me, there is nothing on earth equal to that, although what is nearly equal to it is to go with them for an hour or more, as I like to do on Sunday afternoons, into the woods where we can live for a while near the heart of nature, where no one can disturb or vex us, surrounded by pure air, the trees, the shrubberies, the flowers, and the sweet fragrances that spring from 100 plants, enjoying the chirp of crickets and the song of the birds. This is solid rest. I may have read this to you when I first started reading this, but it's just as fresh to me as it was. My garden also, what little time I can be at Tuskegee, is another source of rest and enjoyment. Somehow I like, as often as possible, to touch nature, not something that is artificial or an imitation, but the real thing. And then he writes about his trip to Europe and what his children are doing, so I want to read that to you. In 1893, I married Miss Margaret James Murray, a native of Mississippi and a graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, who had come to Tuskegee as a teacher several years before, and at the time we were married was filling the position of lady principal. Not only is Mrs. Washington completely one with me in the work directly connected with the school, relieving me of many burdens and perplexities, but aside from her work on the school grounds, she carries on a mothers' meeting at the town of Tuskegee and a plantation work among the women, children, and men who live in a settlement connected with a large plantation about 8 miles from Tuskegee. Both of the mothers' meeting and the plantation work are carried on not only with a view of helping those who are directly reached, but also for the purpose of furnishing object lessons in these 2 kinds of work that may be followed by our students when they go out into the world for their own life work. Aside from these 2 enterprises, Mrs. Washington is also largely responsible for a women's club at the school, which brings together twice a month the women who live on the school grounds and those who live near for the discussion of some important topic. She is also the president of what is known as the Federation of Southern Colored Women's Clubs and chairman of the executive committee of the National Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Portia, the oldest of my 3 children, has learned dressmaking. She has unusual ability in instrumental music. Aside from her studies at Tuskegee, she has already begun to teach there. Booker Taliaferro is my next oldest child. Young as he is, he has already nearly mastered the brick mason's trade. He began working at this trade when he was quite small, dividing his time between this and classwork, and he has developed great skill in the trade and a fondness for it. He said that he is going to be an architect and a brick mason. One of the most satisfactory letters that I have ever received from anyone came to me from Booker last summer. When I left home for the summer, I told him that he must work at his trade half of each day, and that the other half of day he could spend as he pleased. When I had been away from home 2 weeks, I received the following letter from him. Wouldn't that be nice to be able to read, to record a letter one of your children wrote to you and put it in a book? My dear Papa, before you left home, you told me to work at my trade half of each day. I like my work so much that I want to work at my trade all day. Besides, I want to earn all the money I can so that when I go to another school I shall have money to pay my expenses. Your son, Booker. My youngest child, Ernest Davidson Washington, says that he is going to be a physician. In addition to going to school where he studies books and has manual training, he regularly spends a portion of time in the office of our resident physician and has already learned to do many of the duties which pertain to a doctor's office. The thing in my life which brings me the keenest regret is that my work in connection with public affairs keeps me for so much time away from my family, where of all places in the world I delight to be. I always envy the individual whose life work is so laid that he can spend his evenings at home. I have sometimes thought that people who have this rare privilege do not appreciate it as they should. It is such a rest and relief to get away from the crowds of people and handshaking and traveling and get home, even if it be for a little brief while. Another thing at Tuskegee, out of which I get a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction, is the meeting with our students and teachers and their families in the chapel for devotional exercises every evening at 8:30, the last thing before retiring for the night. I always thought that would be an interesting and enjoyable thing to do, and with my family, and just have an appointment to have chapel in your own home every evening and have one of the children prepare some kind of observational, inspirational, or instructional talk. It is an inspiring sight when one stands on the platform there and sees before him 11 or 1200 earnest young men and women, and one cannot but feel that it is a privilege to help guide them to a higher and more useful life. In the spring of 1899 there came to me what I might describe as one of the greatest surprises of my life. Some good ladies in Boston arranged a public meeting in the interests of Tuskegee to be held in the Hollis Street Theater. This meeting was attended by large numbers of the best people of Boston of both races. Bishop Lawrence presided, and in addition to an address made by myself, Mr. Paul Laurence Dunbar read from his poems. Some of those who attended this meeting noticed that I seemed unusually tired, and some little time after the close of the meeting, one of the ladies who had been interested in it asked me in a casual way if I had ever been to Europe. I replied that I never had. She asked me if I'd ever thought of going, and I told her no, that it was something entirely beyond me. This conversation soon passed out of my mind, but a few days afterwards I was informed that some friends in Boston, including Mr. Francis J. Garrison, had raised a sum of money sufficient to pay all the expenses of Mrs. Washington and myself during a 3 or 4 month trip to Europe. It was added with emphasis that we must go. A year previous to this, Mr. Garrison had attempted to get me to promise to go to Europe for a summer's rest, with the understanding that he would be responsible for raising the money among his friends for the expenses of the trip. At that time, such a journey seemed so entirely foreign to anything that I should ever be able to undertake that I confess I did not give the matter very serious attention. But later Mr. Garrison joined his efforts with those ladies with whom I have mentioned, and when their plans were made known to me, Mr. Garrison not only had the route mapped out, but had, I believed, selected the steamer upon which we were to sail. The whole thing was so sudden and so unexpected that I was completely taken off of my feet. I had been at work steadily for 18 years in connection with Tuskegee, and I had never thought of anything else but ending my life in that way. Each day by the school seemed to depend on me more largely for its daily expenses, and I told these Boston friends that while I thanked them sincerely for their thoughtfulness and generosity, I could not go to Europe for the reason that the school could not live financially when I was absent. They then informed me that Mr. Henry L. Higginson and some other good friends, who I know do not want their names made public, were then raising a sum of money which would be sufficient to keep the school in operation while I was away. At this point I was compelled to surrender. Every avenue of escape had been closed. Deep down in my heart the whole thing seemed more like a dream than a reality, and for a long time it was difficult for me to make myself believe that I was actually going to Europe. I had been born and largely reared in the lowest depths of slavery, ignorance, and poverty. And I want to mention, these little notes on the side. I have ordered good books like this from thrift books and others of my favorite places. And for some reason, I've always enjoyed the ones where people had written thoughtful notes on the side, like this one says, thoughts on his trip to Europe. I'm attracted to that because if I'm just skimming through the book, I want to see what they said and what they underlined, and I really enjoy those so much. In my childhood, I had suffered for want of a place to sleep, for lack of food, clothing, and shelter. I had not had the privilege of sitting down to a dining table until I was well grown. Luxuries had always seemed to me to be something meant for other people, not for me. I had always regarded Europe, London, and Paris much as I regard heaven, and now could it be that I was actually going to Europe? Such thoughts of these were constantly with me. Two other thoughts troubled me a good deal. I feared that people who heard that Mrs. Washington and I were going to Europe might not know all the circumstances, and might get the idea that we had become, as one might say, uppity and were trying to show off. I recalled that from my youth I had heard it said that too often when people of my race reached any degree of success, they were inclined to unduly exalt themselves, to try and ape the wealthy. They were inclined to lose their heads. The fear that people might think this of us haunted me a good deal. Then, too, I could not see how my conscience would permit me to spare the time from work and be happy. It seemed mean and selfish in me to be taking a vacation while others were at work, and while there was so much that needed to be done. From the time I could remember, I had always been at work, and I did not see how I could spend 3 or 4 months in doing nothing. The fact was that I did not know how to take a vacation. Mrs. Washington had much the same difficulty in getting away, but she was anxious to go because she thought I needed the rest. There were many important national questions bearing upon the life of the race which were being agitated at the time, and this made it all the harder for us to decide to go. We finally gave our Boston friends our promise that we would go, and then they insisted that the date of our departure be set as soon as possible. So we decided upon May the 10th. My good friend Mr. Garrison kindly took charge of all the details necessary for the success of the trip, and he, as well as other friends, gave us great numbers of letters of introduction to people in France and England, and made other arrangements for our comfort and conversation abroad. Goodbyes were said at Tuskegee, and we were in New York May 9, ready to sail the next day. Our daughter Portia, who was then studying in South Framingham, Massachusetts, came to New York to see us off. Mr. Scott, my secretary, came with me to New York in order that I might clear up the last bit of business before I left. Other friends also came to New York to see us off. Just before we went on board the steamer, another pleasant surprise came to us in form of a letter from 2 generous ladies stating they had decided to give us money with which to erect a new building to be used in properly housing all of our industries for girls at Tuskegee. We were to sail on the Friesland of the Red Star Line, and a beautiful vessel she was. We went on board just before noon, the hour of sailing. I had never before been on board a large ocean steamer, and the feeling which took possession of me when I found myself there is rather hard to describe. It was a feeling, I think, of awe mingled with delight. We were agreeably surprised to find the captain, as well as several of the other officers, not only knew who we were, but were expecting us and gave us a pleasant greeting. There were several passengers whom we knew, including Senator Sewell of New Jersey and Edward Marshall, the newspaper correspondent. I had just a little fear that we would not be treated civilly by some of the passengers. This fear was based upon what I had heard other people of my race who had crossed the ocean say about unpleasant experiences in crossing the ocean in American vessels. But in our case, from the captain down to the most humble servant, we were treated with the greatest kindness. Nor was this kindness confined to those who were connected to the steamer. It was shown by all the passengers also. There were not a few Southern men and women on board, and they were as cordial as those from other parts of the country. As soon as the last goodbyes were said, and the steamer had cut loose from the wharf, the load of care, anxiety, and responsibility which I had carried for 18 years began to lift itself from my shoulders at the rate it seemed to be of a pound a minute. It was the first time in all those years I had felt even in a measure free from care, and my feeling of relief is hard to describe on paper. Added to this was the delightful anticipation of being in Europe soon. It all seemed more like a dream than a reality, and not to diminish the greatness of this story, but you can certainly identify with something like that. You know, especially if you have had raised children and you have a house to take care of, and your husband is employed, and your life is never free. And there they took like a cruise, and he said he felt 18 years of care being lifted from his shoulders. And he said it was hard to be, and that's why I think it's really important to learn to relax at home and to have vacation at home and let that care be lifted and have a lot of care for yourself and your family so that they can feel relaxed, they can feel happy. Mr. Garrison had thoughtfully arranged to have us have one of the most comfortable rooms on the ship. You know, I forgot that I have told you in the past in some of these videos how we pretended we were on a ship when the children were younger, and they would have breakfast in their staterooms, and we would have programs and relaxing time, and we would imagine that we were watching, you know, we were on the ocean and we were watching things go by. And we also studied and used it as a homeschool lesson, and just made a different world. And we got this, you know, from growing up. Our parents taught us how to play train by lining up the chairs, because trains were a big deal in those days. Back in the olden days, everybody knew what a train was. So we'd line up chairs and place them beside the window so we could look out the window and pretend that we were on a train. The second or third day out, I began to sleep, and I think that I slept at the rate of 15 hours a day during the remainder of the 10 days' passage. Then it was that I began to understand how tired I really was. These long sleeps I kept up for a month after we landed on the other side. It was such an unusual feeling to wake up in the morning and realize that I had no engagements, did not have to take a train at a certain hour, did not have an appointment to meet someone, or make an address at a certain hour. How different all this was from some of the experiences that I have been through when traveling, when I have sometimes slept in 3 different beds in a single night. Interesting. But does it remind you of, you know, some of the ways we live? Because we're always so responsible and we're always so busy and very conscious of how people are depending on us. When Sunday came, the captain invited me to conduct the religious services, but not being a minister, I declined. The passengers, however, began making requests that I deliver an address to them in the dining saloon sometimes during the voyage, which I consented to do. Senator Sowell presided at this meeting. After 10 days of delightful weather, during which I was not seasick for one day, we landed at the interesting old city of Antwerp in Belgium. The next day after we landed happened to be one of the numberless holidays which the people of those countries are in the habit of observing. It was a bright, beautiful day. Our room in the hotel faced the main public square, and the sights there, the people coming in from the country with all kinds of beautiful flowers to sell, the women coming in with their dogs drawing large, brightly polished cans filled with milk, the people streaming into the cathedral, filled me with a sense of newness that I have never before experienced. After spending some time in Antwerp, we were invited to go with a party of half a dozen persons on a trip through Holland. This party included Edward Marshall and some American artists who had come over on the same steamer with us. We accepted the invitation and enjoyed the trip greatly. I think it was all the more interesting and instructive because we went for most of the way on one of the slow, old-fashioned canal boats. This gave us an opportunity of seeing and studying the real life of the people in the country districts. We went in this way as far as Rotterdam and later went to The Hague, where the peace conference was then in session, and where we were kindly received by the American representatives. The thing that impressed itself most on me in Holland was the thoroughness of the agriculture and the excellence of the Holstein cattle. I never knew before visiting Holland how much it was possible for people to get out of a small plot of ground. It seemed to me that absolutely no land was wasted. It was worth a trip to Holland just to get a sight of 300 or 400 fine Holstein cows grazing in one of those intensely green fields. Holsteins are so beautiful. From Holland we went to Belgium and made a hasty trip through the country, stopping at Brussels, where we visited a battlefield of Waterloo. From Belgium we went direct to Paris, where we found that Mr. Theodore Stanton, the son of Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had kindly provided accommodations for us. We had barely got settled in Paris before an invitation came to me from the University Club of Paris to be its guest at a banquet which was soon to be given. The other guests were ex-President Benjamin Harrison, the Archbishop of Ireland, who were in Paris at the time. The American ambassador, General Horace Porter, presided at the banquet. My address on this occasion seemed to give satisfaction to those who heard it. General Harrison kindly devoted a large portion of his remarks at dinner to myself and to the influence of the work at Tuskegee on the American race question. After my address at this banquet, other invitations came to me, but I declined most of them, knowing that if I accepted them all, the object of my visit would be defeated. I did, however, consent to deliver an address in the American chapel the following Sunday morning, and at this meeting General Harrison, General Porter, and other distinguished Americans were present. Later we received a formal call from the American ambassador and were invited to attend a reception at his residence. At this reception we met many Americans, among them Justices Fuller and Harlan of the United States Supreme Court. During our entire stay of a month in Paris, both the American ambassador and his wife, as well as several other Americans, were very kind to us. While in Paris, we saw a good deal of the now famous American Negro painter, Mr. Henry O. Tanner. Okay, I don't know who he was, and I don't know why he's not more promoted. So I'll read the footnote. Henry Ossawa Tanner, 1859 to 1937, African-American expatriate painter. I will have to look him up. During our entire stay of a month in Paris, both the American ambassador and his wife, as well as several other Americans, were very kind to us. When we told some Americans that we were going to Luxembourg Palace to see a painting by an American Negro, it was hard to convince them that a Negro had been thus honored. I do not believe they were really convinced of this fact until they saw the picture for themselves. My acquaintance with Mr. Tanner reinforced in my mind the truth that I am constantly trying to impress upon our students at Tuskegee and upon our people throughout the country, as far as I can reach them with my voice, that any man, regardless of color, will be recognized and rewarded just in proportion as he learns to do something well, learns to do it better than someone else, however humble the thing may be. As I have said, I believe that my race will succeed in proportion as it learns to do a common thing in an uncommon manner, learns to do a thing so thoroughly that no one can improve upon what has been done, learns to make its service of indispensable value. This was the spirit that inspired me in my first effort at Hampton. And when I was given the opportunity to sweep and dust that schoolroom, in a degree I felt that my whole future life depended on the thoroughness with which I cleaned that room, and I was determined to do it so well that no one could find fault with the job. Now, I would like to read more about that, especially these paintings that he saw. And but I want to save my voice because I am determined to get to Anne of Green Gables, which was one of the stories inserted in here, so it's certainly not all the complete books. So we left off when Anne was asked to wash the dishes, and she said, I can wash them, but I'm better at looking after children because that's what was my duty in the asylum for orphans. So she said, yes, I will wash the dishes. And Marilla said that, and Anne said that she really liked Matthew. She said, I think Matthew is lovely. He is so very sympathetic. Now, you know, Anne of Green Gables was a book written by Ellen Montgomery, who apparently lived a harsh life. I saw a documentary of her once, including, I think, maybe there was a recording of her own voice, but there were a film of where she lived, and some of the stories of her life were in this film. And so she had written, she'd had a pretty hard life, was kind of confined at home, looking after, I believe, one of her aged grandparents or parents, not quite sure which one. But she found great relief in these stories. And I think that all of us should learn to write, and our children should learn to write too, especially when we're discouraged, and create a life that we would like to have, or create a character. And that reminds me, I heard recently from Miss Lily of the Valley, and she has a little bit longer story this time. So hopefully I'll read that to you in a few more videos down the line. So Marilla said it's both, she said, Anne had previously said, I felt that Matthew was a kindred spirit as soon as I ever saw him. And that's the first time we see the phrase kindred spirit. And it just meant somebody that you feel at home with and that is like you and thinks like you. You're both strange, she said Marilla, if that's what you mean by kindred spirits. Well, you may wash the dishes. Take plenty of hot water and be sure you dry them well. I've got enough to attend to this morning. Now, I don't know the dates of this author, but I'm thinking that it's kind of probably in the early 20th century. Make sure you dry them well. I've got enough to attend to this morning, for I'll have to drive over to White Sands in the afternoon and see Mrs. Spencer. You'll come with me, and we'll settle what's to be done with you. After you've finished the dishes, go upstairs and make your bed. Anne washed the dishes deftly enough, as Marilla, who kept a sharp eye on the process, discerned. Later on, she made her bed less successfully, for she had never learned the art of wrestling with a feather tick. But it was done somehow and smoothed down, and then Marilla, to get rid of her, told her she might go out of doors and amuse herself until dinner time. Anne flew to the door, face alight, eyes glowing. On the very threshold she stopped short, wheeled about, came back, and sat down by the table, light and glow as effectively blotted out as if someone had clapped an extinguisher on her. Yeah, that poor thing, you know. Have you ever been like that, where you're all eager and your face is light, and then something happens and it just knocks out the light out of your personality? What's the matter now? Demanded Marilla. I don't dare go out, said Anne in the tone of a martyr relinquishing all earthly joys. If I can't stay here, there's no use in my loving Green Gables, and if I go out there and get acquainted with all those trees and flowers and the orchard and the brook, I will not help loving it. It's hard enough now, so I won't make it any harder. I want to go out so much. Everything seems to be calling to me. Anne, Anne, come out to us. Anne, Anne, we want a playmate, but I better not. You know, interesting how Ellen Montgomery wrote that whoever reads the words that she put of Anne kind of turns into this spunky, excited, discovering type personality. And I know when my mother read it, she became Anne when she was reading it. And when I'm reading it, and if they say that she was wide-eyed, I feel wide-eyed. I feel excited. I thought I'd have so many things here to love and nothing to hinder me, but that brief dream is over. I am resigned to my fate now, so I don't think I'll go out for fear I'll get unresigned again. What's the name of that geranium on the windowsill, please? That's an apple-scented geranium, said Marilla. Oh, I don't mean that sort of name. I mean just a name you gave it yourself. Didn't you give it a name? May I give it one then? May I call it, let me see, Bonnie would do. May I call it Bonnie while I'm here? Oh, let me do. Goodness, I don't care, but where on earth is the sense of naming a geranium? Oh, I like things to have handles, even if they are only geraniums. It makes them seem more like people. How do you know but that it hurts a geranium's feelings just to be called a geranium and nothing else? You wouldn't like to be called nothing but a woman all the time, would you? Yes, I shall call it Bonnie. I named that cherry tree outside my bedroom window this morning. I called it Snow Queen because it was so white. Of course, it won't always be in blossom, but one can imagine that it is, can't one? I never in all my life saw or heard anything equal to her, muttered Marilla, beating a retreat down the cellar after potatoes. She is kind of interesting, as Matthew says. I can feel already that I'm wondering what on earth she'll say next. She'll be casting a spell over me, too. She's cast it over Matthew. That look he gave me when he went out and said everything he said or hinted last night over again. I wish he was like other men and would talk things out. A body would answer back and then argue him into reason. But what's to be done with a man who just looks? Anne had relapsed into reverie, with her chin in her hands and her eyes on the sky, when Marilla returned from her cellar pilgrimage. There Marilla left her until early dinner was on the table. I suppose I can have the mare and buggy this afternoon, Matthew? Asked Marilla. Matthew nodded and looked wistfully at Anne. Marilla intercepted the look and said grimly, I'm going to drive over to White Sands and settle this thing. I'll take Anne with me, and Mrs. Spencer will probably make arrangements to send her back to Nova Scotia at once. I'll set your tea out for you, and I'll be home in time to milk the cows. Still Matthew said nothing, and Marilla had a sense of having wasted words and breath. There was nothing more aggravating than a man who won't talk back unless it's a woman who won't. Matthew hitched the sorrel into the buggy in due time, and Marilla and Anne set off. Matthew opened the yard gate for them, and they drove slowly through it. He said, to nobody in particular, it seemed, little Jerry Bout from the creek was here this morning, and I told him I guess I'd hire him for this summer. Marilla made no reply, but she hit the unlucky sorrel such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the lane in an alarming pace. Marilla looked back at the buggy once as the buggy bounced along and saw the aggravating Matthew leaning over the gate looking wistfully after them. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she came to the door with surprise, and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. Dear, dear, she explained, you're the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in, and how are you, Anne? I'm as well as I can be expected, thank you, said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended upon her. I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare, said Marilla, but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see where it is. We'll send word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from... We sent word, Matthew and I, to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy, 10 or 11 years old. Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say, said Mrs. Spencer in distress. Why, Robert sent the word down by his daughter, Nancy, and she said you wanted a girl. Didn't she, Flora Jane, appealing to her daughter, who had come to the steps? She certainly did, Miss Cuthbert, corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. I'm dreadfully sorry, said Mrs. Spencer. It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I've often had to scold her well for heedlessness. It was our own fault, said Marilla resignedly. We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do now is set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they? I suppose so, said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she'd sent me a girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for you. I call it positively providential. Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett only by a slight as a small, shrewish-faced woman with an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones, but she had heard of her, a terrible worker and driver, Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to their tender mercies. "Well, I'll go in and we'll talk the matter over," she said. "And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute," explained Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall and the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained so long through dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had even lost every particle of warmth it had ever possessed. "This is real lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert, and you sit there on the ottoman and don't wriggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened to be along. Let me introduce you two ladies. Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven." Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given into the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep back the tears, when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, and spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. Excuse me. "It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett," she said. "I was under the impression that Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so." There's a lot of wheat chaff coming in here, and I've got the door open from the fields. "But it seems it was a boy she wanted, so if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you." Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. "How old are you, and what's your name?" she demanded. "Anne Shirley," faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof, "and I'm 11 years old." "You don't look as if there was much to you, but you're wiry. I don't know but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, I'll take you, and you'll have to be a good girl, you know, good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, make no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful factious, and I'm getting clean worn out attending to him. If you like, I can take her right now." Matthew's shy face. Oh, these pages are stuck together. Marilla looked at Anne and softened at the sight of the child's pale face, with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds herself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look it would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett. To hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman, no, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. "Well, I don't know," she said slowly. "I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel I oughtn't to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring her or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she's going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett?" "I suppose it will have to," said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. During Marilla's speech a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First the look of despair faded out, then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured, and a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it, or did I only imagine that you did?" "I think you better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't," said Marilla crossly. "Yes, you did hear me say just that, and no more. It wasn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than go live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go sit back down and quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try to do and be anything you want me if only you'll keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to the ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla from afar had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read on his face when she saw that she had at least brought Anne back. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman," said Matthew with an unusual vim. "I don't fancy her myself," admitted Marilla, "but it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew, and since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems sort of a duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it. But I'll do my best, so far as I'm concerned. Matthew, she may stay." Matthew's face was a glow of delight. "Well, now, I reckoned you'd come to see it in that light, Marilla," he said. "She's such an interesting little thing." "It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing," retorted Marilla, "but I'll make it my business to see she's trained to do that. And mind, Matthew, you're not going to interfere with my method. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor, so you better just leave me manage her." "Well, there, Marilla, you can have it your way," he said. "Only be as good and kind to her as you can be without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort that you could do anything with if you only get her to love you." Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. I won't tell her tonight that she can stay," she reflected as she strained the milk into the creamer. "She'd be so excited she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it. Him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyway, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it." And then the reader has some questions, like, from what story does this country come? And why didn't Marilla want Anne? What was Anne really hungry for? And why wasn't she hungry for food? Why was Marilla sharp with Anne, and how did Marilla change her attitude? And did you think Anne would be a good friend, and why? So, ladies, I hope you enjoyed the reading of that. And you can go online and find the book being read, both on YouTube and other places, by other people. Probably some people that may be more familiar with it, and in a nice Canadian accent. So, ladies, I hope you got a few things done today, and that you will sit and read a little bit and have a lovely day. And we'll talk to you later. Bye.